The camera pans over a quiet Louisiana town at dawn. A gentle breeze rustles through trees. A new life has just arrived, full of promise. But in a matter of weeks, that promise will collapse into a nightmare no one expected. In the small city of Opelousas, Louisiana, a community of roughly 15,000 people, about an hour west of Baton Rouge, a young couple welcomed into their home something they called a blessing, their baby girl. The world saw the smiles, the hospital photos, the social media posts. But behind those images, something was going terribly wrong. Meet the couple at the center of this case. Kaye Fontenot and Allora Fay Broussard. By all outward appearances, they were a young, engaged pair, preparing to build a life together. Social media posts show Taylor proposing to Kaye on a waterfront at the end of 2024. From the outside, it looked like a story many would envy. Love, hope, the dawn of parenthood. When their daughter was born in August 2025, the moment seemed perfect. The couple held their newborn in hospital photos, beaming. The little girl's name? Allora Fay Broussard, sometimes spelled Allora Fay in reports. Here was a bright new beginning. The posts were full of pride. My baby girl, my twin, and my beautiful little angel. Taylor wrote on Facebook after her passing, "I'm so broken. I miss you every second of the day." But behind the photos and posts, investigators would later say a different story was playing out, one of hidden suffering. Newborn babies are vulnerable. They demand round-the-clock care. They cannot speak or protect themselves. In their first 2 months of life, every feeding matters. Every cry must be answered, and every moment of neglect or abuse can leave devastating marks. According to the lead law enforcement agency in this case, the Opelousas Police Department discovered that Allora was exclusively in the custody of her parents, Kaye and Taylor, from birth. In other words, no outside caregiver stepping in, no daycare, no babysitter beyond them. That fact, investigators say, becomes vital in understanding how and why this tragic outcome unfolded. On the morning of Saturday, October 25, 2025, around 8 a.m., police were dispatched to a residence on North Liberty Street in Opelousas. Reports indicated that the infant, only 2 months old, wasn't breathing. Firefighters and paramedics were on scene, mounting life-saving efforts. But by the time she arrived at the hospital, the little girl had already lost her life. This should have been the final sad chapter of an infant's life, an accidental tragedy. But as autopsy results and the investigation would show, this was far from simple. An investigation into what the couple said happened would unravel a far darker timeline. Here are the findings that turned a tragic story into a criminal investigation. The autopsy revealed extreme dehydration and malnourishment in the infant, conditions that don't occur overnight in a healthy home. There were multiple broken ribs, some in various stages of healing. That means at least some injuries were not from one incident but had developed over time. Investigators also found a severed lower spine, which caused fatal internal bleeding. A spinal injury of this kind is extraordinarily uncommon in infants without major external trauma. The medical examiners concluded that the spinal injury, combined with the other signs of neglect and abuse, caused the baby's death. All told, these findings changed the way investigators looked at the case. This was no accident or moment of frustration. This was ongoing, severe abuse and neglect. At first glance, Taylor's public post 4 days after his daughter's death reflected a father's heartbreak. "You are so much like me and your mother combined. Daddy misses you so much. I can barely think right now." But then, law enforcement sources said that when they dug deeper, things didn't add up. The couple's public image, young parents, happy together, doting on their baby, was a facade masking evidence of repeated harm. Because the parents were the only ones with custody, investigators began to focus their attention on them as the likely responsible parties for the harm done. With no outside caregiver in the mix, responsibility falls squarely, in the eyes of the investigation, on the two adults who were entrusted with the child's life. From being mourners to being suspects, the shift was swift and widespread. Arrest warrants for both parents were issued, charged with first-degree murder, cruelty to juveniles, and second-degree battery. The investigation is described by police as ongoing and early stage, but the evidence is already deeply troubling. In a town like Opelousas, where people recognize one another, the idea that a little infant could suffer in this way is deeply unsettling. The scenario touches on every parent's worst fear, that the person entrusted with a child could become the child's greatest harm. Experts say that when an infant demonstrates signs of chronic neglect, malnourishment, dehydration, and simultaneous traumatic physical injury like broken ribs or a severed spine, it signals intent and repetition rather than a single tragedy. The combination of neglect plus trauma raises the threshold of suspicion dramatically. As a community watches and awaits more answers, the heartache is multiplied by confusion. How could this happen so soon after a child's birth? What went unseen in those early weeks and days? For the little girl named Allora Fay, those questions are moot. Her life ended too soon, her story cut short. When the baby girl, named Allora Fay Broussard, was born in August 2025, it looked like the start of a typical hopeful journey. Her parents, Kaye Fontenot and Allora Broussard, posted pictures of their new arrival, hospital moments filled with pride and promise. They were young, engaged, living in a small-town setting, and doing parenthood just like 1,000 other young couples. Yet in the weeks that followed, something unseen began to develop behind closed doors. Investigators now say that from birth, Allora was in the exclusive custody of her parents, meaning that daycare, outside babysitters, or third-party caregivers were not involved, according to police. That fact will become critically important in how the case unfolds. From the autopsy and the investigation, a pattern emerges. Injuries and neglect that didn't happen all at once but accumulated. Severe dehydration and malnourishment were found. An infant cannot become malnourished overnight. It takes days, weeks of insufficient nutrition and care. Multiple broken ribs were discovered, and some of those ribs were in the healing stage. That means the baby had suffered rib fractures at earlier times, not just the fatal moment. The cause of death was ultimately linked to a severed lower spine producing internal bleeding, an extreme physical trauma for a baby only 2 months old. Each one of these injuries alone would raise alarms. Together, they signaled something far more sinister: neglect plus active harm over time. In a small house on North Liberty Street, in a town where everyone notices new babies, questions now swirl around what signs might have been ignored. Friends, family, neighbors? In many child abuse cases, someone, a relative, a nurse, or a daycare worker spots something. But here, investigators say it was only the parents with care. That fact helps explain why no outside alarm was raised sooner. Imagine the 8-week-old baby lying in a crib. A nurse might check her weight during a pediatric visit. A grandparent might notice she's smaller than expected, less active. But when only the parents are present, the safety net is absent, and the injuries begin their quiet accumulation. We don't have full public detail on every moment leading up to October 25th. Investigators say the case remains in early stages. But from what is available, here are the warning signs. 1. Malnutrition and dehydration. These are signs of chronic neglect: not feeding the infant properly, not giving fluids or nourishment appropriate for her age. 2. Healing fractures. The presence of broken ribs in different stages of healing suggests repeated trauma, not a single incident. 3. Extreme physical trauma to the spine. Severing or severely injuring the lower spine is not likely an accident in a 2-month-old. The physical force required suggests direct intentional harm. 4. Lack of outside oversight. With no other caregiver involved, there was no external checkpoint. That made the home environment virtually closed off from external eyes. Together, these clues paint a portrait of a baby suffering in plain sight but silenced by isolation. In Opelousas, Louisiana, a town of about 15,000 people, everyone knows someone. Yet this horror unfolded quietly, perhaps because the parents put on a public face. Social media posts showed the happy new parent life. Friends may have seen smiles, hospital births, baby pictures, but those posts capture only what is visible, not what is hidden. That dissonance between image and reality is one of the darkest parts of this case. The same couple who looked like new parents stepping into joy were, According to investigators, the only caregivers entrusted with a baby whose short life ended in unspeakable suffering. On the morning of October 25, 2025, at about 8 a.m., first responders were called to the North Liberty Street home. They found the 2-month-old not breathing. They tried life-saving measures. The infant was rushed to hospital, but she did not survive. A few days later, the father posted publicly on Facebook, "My baby girl, my twin, and my beautiful little angel. Until we meet again, rest in peace, my angel." From grief-stricken father to suspect parent, the shift occurred when the autopsy came back and revealed the hidden injuries. Investigators realized this wasn't a sudden collapse. This was a long-term ordeal. Warrants were issued for both Kaye Fontenot and Allora Broussard for charges including first-degree murder, cruelty to juveniles, and second-degree battery. Fontenot was taken into custody first, and Broussard later turned himself in on November 3rd. For investigators and prosecutors, the timeline matters. One incident could be called an accident, moment of frustration, tragic lapse. But when there are patterns of neglect plus active injury, malnourishment and fractured ribs and spinal trauma, the legal story becomes one of intent rather than mishap. Experts say that chronic neglect, lack of feedings, fluids, combined with repeated injuries is strong evidence for intentional harm, rather than just one disastrous moment. The autopsy findings in this case, especially the multiple broken ribs in various healing stages, place this scenario likely in that second category. At the same time, defense strategy often tries to raise the possibility of another caregiver, of an unknown third party, of accidental harm. But when only the parents had custodial access and the child was in their exclusive care since birth, that argument becomes very difficult for the defense to sustain. Investigators have pointed to the parents as the only likely ones responsible for the timeline of injuries. Many activists and experts who deal with infant abuse cases point to a chilling fact. The earlier the age of the victim, the more vulnerable they are, and the more pronounced the signs tend to be if something is wrong. A 2-month-old cannot protect herself or communicate for help. Malnourishment and dehydration at that age are especially dangerous. Combine that with multiple broken ribs and spine damage and you confront the worst kind of abuse. In this pathetic span of time, the child should have been gaining weight, gaining head control, responding to voices. Instead, the timeline shows decline. That rapid deterioration forms the backbone of the prosecution's case. That this was not boarded under the umbrella of ignorance, but under the umbrella of sustained harm. When emergency responders arrived at the North Liberty Street home on October 25, 2025, the scene was quiet, almost eerily so. A 2-month-old baby lay unresponsive. The young mother, 18-year-old Kaye Fontenot, looked frantic, and the father, 20-year-old Allora Broussard, tried to explain that the baby just stopped breathing. Paramedics rushed Allora to the local hospital, but by the time she arrived, there was no pulse. She was pronounced dead shortly after 8 a.m. For the first few hours, it was treated as a sudden infant death, one of those unexplained, heartbreaking events. But doctors at the hospital noticed something unusual: bruising near the ribcage, swelling along the lower back, and a physical stiffness that didn't fit the usual pattern for a sudden infant death case. Those observations triggered an automatic notification to law enforcement. Within hours, Opelousas police detectives were called in. An autopsy was ordered through the St. Landry Parish Coroner's Office. The forensic pathologist's report would later become the cornerstone of the case. The examination took hours, a painstaking process of documenting every mark, bruise, and fracture. What they found stunned even seasoned investigators. The infant was severely underweight for her age, weighing roughly 5 pounds less than expected for a healthy 2-month-old. There were multiple rib fractures on both sides of the chest. Some of them had already begun healing, suggesting they were inflicted weeks before death. The baby's spine showed a devastating injury, a separation in the lower vertebrae consistent with violent bending or shaking. Internal bleeding around the spinal cord and abdomen confirmed that this injury occurred close to the time of death. Dehydration and malnourishment were also evident. No stomach contents, no signs of recent feeding. In medical terms, this was not the story of a baby who suddenly stopped breathing. It was the story of a baby who had been starved, beaten, and fatally injured over time. According to reports from local outlets like KPLC News 7 and People, the coroner's team shared their findings directly with police. The combination of fresh and healing fractures, a severed spine, and dehydration immediately ruled out accident or SIDS. One examiner later described the findings as among the most severe we've seen in an infant this age. The medical team also noted a pattern consistent with repeated compression or squeezing around the ribs, injuries that could come from shaking a baby forcefully or pressing too hard while handling. When detectives compared these injuries with the parents' initial statements, inconsistencies began to surface. Both parents were interviewed separately by detectives. At first, Kaye Fontenot claimed she had been asleep when she noticed the baby unresponsive. She said Taylor had been up with Allora earlier that morning and may have fed her, but investigators noted there was no bottle, no formula, no sign of recent feeding anywhere in the home. When questioned about bruises and weight loss, Kaye said the baby had always been small. Allora Broussard, meanwhile, told police he didn't know what happened. He said he had picked up his daughter and she suddenly went limp. But as forensic details emerged, including the broken ribs and spinal injury, those explanations fell apart. Detectives pointed out that the type of force required to cause such damage was not accidental. Shaking, jerking, or bending a 2-month-old could cause exactly that type of spinal separation. After several hours of questioning, both parents stopped cooperating and requested lawyers. The findings led the Opelousas Police Department to seek arrest warrants for both parents. Kaye Fontenot was taken into custody first, charged with first-degree murder, second-degree cruelty to juveniles, battery of a juvenile. Shortly after, an arrest warrant was issued for Allora Broussard, who was initially reported as being at large. For several days, authorities searched for him, until he eventually turned himself in on November 3, 2025. Both were booked into St. Landry Parish Jail, with bonds set at over $500,000 each. Detectives also examined the couple's social media activity. Just days before the child's death, posts showed Taylor writing about family life, struggling but strong, and photos of the baby in what appeared to be normal condition. However, investigators noticed that the images stopped abruptly. Between late September and October, there were no posts, no visible record of the baby's condition. In the digital era, those gaps can tell their own story, not just what was shared, but what was suddenly hidden. Crime scene photos taken by Opelousas police and obtained later through warrants showed a sparsely furnished apartment. Baby formula containers were nearly empty. Bottles in the sink were unwashed, some filled with sour milk residue. Detectives noted the absence of diapers, wipes, or fresh baby clothes. A single crib sat in the corner with stained bedding. These details reinforced the medical evidence. Neglect wasn't an accident. It was a daily pattern. In a public briefing, Opelousas Police Chief Martin McClendon addressed the case with visible emotion. This is one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking cases we've handled. The level of suffering inflicted on this infant is unimaginable. We're pursuing justice for a baby who had no voice, no chance to defend herself. The statement resonated across Louisiana. Residents flooded online forums expressing disbelief that such brutality could occur in their quiet town. Some even organized a small candlelight vigil outside the police department, leaving stuffed animals and flowers under a handmade sign reading "Justice for Allora Fay." In homicide cases involving infants, forensic consistency is everything. The autopsy findings, injury timelines, and lack of alternative suspects make this case particularly strong for prosecutors. The healing ribs demonstrate ongoing trauma. The malnutrition and dehydration prove prolonged neglect. The spinal injury ties directly to the cause of death. Together, these build a timeline of violence, not a single act of rage, but a slow, fatal progression of harm. As of now, both defendants have pleaded not guilty. Their attorneys argue that the baby's death was a tragic medical incident, possibly linked to a fall or accidental mishandling. But medical experts consulted by multiple outlets dismissed those theories. Dr. Sharon Klein, a pediatric forensic specialist not connected to the case, explained to reporters, You can't sever a 2-month-old spinal column through a fall from a bed or being picked up the wrong way. That level of force is deliberate. The prosecution will rely heavily on expert testimony like this when the case goes to trial. As the investigation unfolds, one thing becomes clear: Allora's short life left behind undeniable proof of her suffering. Every fracture, every bruise, every sign of starvation is now part of the official record. Her story, once hidden behind social media smiles, is now told through evidence. For the parents, Kaye Fontenot and Allora Broussard, the public grieving ended quickly and the legal process began. Fontenot was first arrested and charged with first-degree murder, cruelty to juveniles, and second-degree battery. Broussard turned himself in on November 3, 2025, and faced the same charges. In that moment, the crime was no longer just a community shock. It became a full criminal case, backed by disturbing medical evidence. Prosecutors now hold in their hands the autopsy, the fractures, the malnourishment data, all of which shift this from a tragic death to a homicide investigation. Legal observers note that despite the parents being engaged, not yet married, per social media evidence, their legal status as custodial parents is what matters most. They were the only adults who had exclusive custody of Allora from birth, according to police. What makes this case particularly strong? The layers of evidence. Multiple broken ribs in healing stages, which suggest repeated trauma, not a single event. Malnourishment and dehydration, indicating sustained neglect. A severed lower spine, causing fatal internal bleeding, a type of injury unlikely to occur by accident in a 2-month-old. These combine to build a narrative of intentional injury, rather than an accidental mishap. Prosecutors will likely emphasize the pattern of abuse theory, that the child's condition deteriorated over time under the only people responsible for her care. In their statements, law enforcement called the level of abuse unimaginable. The public release from the police chief asked for cooperation and patience, emphasizing this was still an ongoing investigation. On the flip side, the defense faces enormous uphill work. The classic "someone else did it" or accidental injury line is difficult when the parents had exclusive custody and no other caregiver was identified. The defense may argue, "We did not intend harm. This was an accident or a tragic result of a medical condition." But medical experts say that the severity of the spine injury and chronic neglect signs make that argument weak. A key play may be plea negotiations. With first-degree murder and multiple aggravating factors, including a child victim under 12 months, the stakes are high. A plea deal could minimize sentence but publicly may seem like a concession of guilt. Two things matter especially for the jury: the timing of injuries, old and new, and the lack of credible alternative explanation. With both parents implicated, co-defense tension may appear. Each might try to shift blame. The prosecution may use that to strengthen its case. In the town of Opelousas, Louisiana, life has been shaken. A child's death, once seen as unimaginable, becomes a harsh reality in small-town headlines. Neighbors spoke of shock, disbelief, and questions. Could this have been prevented? Local groups and child welfare advocates now point to this case as a wake-up call. They emphasize the importance of monitoring newborns' growth and weight gain, the value of others, family members, pediatricians, social services, paying attention when something seems off, the need for support systems for young parents who might struggle. For many in the region, Allora's story is no longer just a crime, it's a catalyst. Churches, community centers, and schools began organizing talks about infant safety, neglect signals, and how to spot warning signs early. Although Allora only lived for 2 months, her story will carry lessons far beyond her short life. Her body told the truth no one else could speak, and her legacy is now one of awareness and justice. There are at least 2 enduring threads. Justice. The criminal case must still run its course. The prosecution, the courts, the jury, all will play roles. For the family of Allora, for the town, and for the principle that no child should suffer in silence. Prevention. Every baby deserves safe care. Every parent deserves support. The community now has a tangible reminder of what can happen in the absence of oversight and care. The story of Allora Fay Broussard is tragic, but it is not meaningless. From hospital photos and social media posts to autopsy reports and criminal charges, the journey reveals the gap between image and reality, between what we hope for our children and what some children endure. As viewers and as a society, we can ask, what did we miss? What systems failed? And as we wait for the court's verdict, the bigger question lingers. How do we ensure no other child's life ends this way? For her life, though brief, Allora spoke through her injuries, and now through our attention. This is her legacy. This is our responsibility. Thank you for watching. You've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, empathy, and respect for those who can no longer speak for themselves. If you found this story important, don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth coverage of real cases that matter. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think about this case. Let the memory of Allora Fay remind us to keep watching, keep caring, and keep holding accountable. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.